Mascots. Strange things with roles that can be played either by animals, people, or things. They're supposed to be used as representative symbols, and also supposed to bring good luck. However, mascots also play a different role, of being used to represent consumer products. In some cases, mascots come off as more as a cheap attempt to get us to like a particular product that we would otherwise have absolutely no interest in whatsoever, and probably wouldn't even have known the product existed if it weren't for said mascot. But what about when mascots are used for gaming? For gaming, mascots end up drawing attention to a console by acting as the representative for that company, like Mario does for Nintendo or Sonic did for Sega. But did you notice when the PlayStation launched, there was no mascot for it? Unlike Nintendo and Sega, Sony released the PlayStation with no main character to represent the console at the start of its generation, nor did they add one in later. My question to you is, was it a mistake for Sony to not add a mascot to represent their console? A lot of you may be thinking, well, why should they? Some of you may believe that one of Sony's strengths was their ability to survive without a mascot to represent them, and I'll admit that at the start it did seem that way. But looking at Sony now, I can't help but think that maybe, just maybe, a mascot wouldn't have been such a bad idea. Now, as I've said, when you realize that the success of the PS1 and 2 happened without the help of a mascot, you can't help but think that Sony's console was good enough without a mascot to represent it. But did you ever stop to ask yourself why it worked out so well for Sony? Or why Sony was able to beat the competition so easily without the aid of a mascot back then? To figure that out, you'd have to first know just what the hell the competition was doing that allowed Sony to become so successful in the first place. With the 16-bit era coming to an end, the release of the PlayStation in '94 brought us into the 32-bit console era. At this point, Sony's main competition was Nintendo and Sega. Nintendo's genius idea for a 32-bit machine was the Virtual Boy, and most of you know how that worked out. And the Sega Saturn couldn't gain the same market share as PlayStation did in both North America and Europe. These two things alone made it pretty easy for Sony to become successful without the need of a good advertising gimmick. Hell, last generation, just the word PlayStation 2 alone was enough to take the Dreamcast out of the picture, despite how good of a console the Dreamcast really was. And Nintendo's bright idea to use 1.5GB mini DVDs due to their concern with piracy instead of the 4.7GB DVDs the PlayStation 2 used made many multi-plat games limited on the GameCube due to the disc space, despite the fact that the GameCube was indeed the more powerful machine. Because of this, Sony yet again didn't need a mascot to carry them. Nintendo's mistakes were all Sony needed. But despite Nintendo's mistakes, the one thing they could always rely on was their mascots. Even if the console wasn't as successful as people expected, the mascot still carried it. And now it looks like Sony is in the same position, but doesn't really have anything to carry it. With Microsoft, the issue seemed to work in a different way, as it seemed like it had more to do with luck than anything else. Despite being the most powerful console last gen, it was almost dead on arrival. With over a year head start, the PS2 was the best selling console on the market, and since Xbox never appealed to Japanese gamers due to Microsoft's neglect of the Japanese market, this ended up giving the Xbox a low user base. Microsoft didn't start off with a mascot, but instead the mascot was chosen for them by their own fanbase. Master Chief wasn't thrown in everyone's face as the Xbox representative. If it had been, the plan would have easily backfired, because most of the fanbase were either in their late teens or adults, and at that point it's much harder to tell us what we should like. While with Nintendo, most of us were kids then. And as kids, it's much easier to convince us to like a specific character. So Nintendo using Mario as a mascot back then worked out better. However, if Mario were to just pop up on the Wii this gen, I can almost guarantee you that he wouldn't have been accepted as easily. Master Chief was accepted by the fans of Halo, and Halo was Microsoft's main seller, so the pieces were easily put together. Microsoft just happened to get lucky by releasing the right game at the perfect time in a country that easily accepted it. Halo was all the Xbox needed last gen, and to an extent this gen to survive. Mario is all that we really needed to survive. But what exactly does Sony have to survive? The question now is, can Sony even introduce a character that majority of us will accept? At the start of this generation, I would have suggested Solid Snake. However, I had completely forgotten that Konami did make Metal Gear games for other consoles other than the PlayStation and PlayStation 2. And I realized that a mascot for Sony would have to be a brand new character that can represent the majority of PS3 gamers. My second choice was Sackboy, but the problem with him is, too many of this gen's gamers find him to be rather childish. With this generation, most people were waiting for a new Halo on the Xbox 360. Most people were also waiting for a new Mario on the new Nintendo console, the Wii. But what were people waiting for on the PS3? My guess would be Metal Gear Solid 4. The problem was the fact that the PS3 was released November 11th of 06, and Metal Gear Solid 4 was released June 12th of 08. Now I'm pretty sure a lot of you would disagree with this next statement, but I truly believe this was the reason why the Xbox 360 sales jump didn't have to do so much with the year early release everyone says, as it did Sony not having games to represent it on its release, i.e. a mascot. Add to that their main game wasn't even going to be released for another year and a half, so this generation we ended up with three things at the start. We had a weak console but a strong mascot, a non-reliable console but a mascot that represented a genre that took this generation over, and a powerful console with nothing. And even with all the games that we have for the PS3 now, who could really carry the ball? Sony won't have it as easily as Microsoft did with the main shooter character, because let's face it, unlike Master Chief, hardly anyone cares about Sev, and most of the people that play the game probably don't even know he exists, since story modes are normally skipped for any shooter that isn't Halo. I believe that Sony needs specific games they can rely on every gen, just in case something like what happened this gen happens again. We all know that Microsoft used some pretty cheap tactics this gen to get ahead, and while their tactics worked well against Sony, Nintendo was a step ahead of Microsoft, because as I've said in a previous video, Nintendo's been there and they've done that. And we can see now that when Sony goes up against some heavy competition, they can no longer rely on their name alone like they did the last two gens. As I've said before, when people heard of the PS2 last gen, the Dreamcast became obsolete. But when people heard of the PS3 this gen, the Xbox 360 still stood strong. And even years later, it's still standing. Do I think Sony needs a mascot? Yes. Do I think they can get one this generation? Maybe not. I think if Sony were to try and get a character to represent them, it would have to be either on the PS Vita or the next gen PlayStation, PlayStation 4 or Orbis. It was easier for Mario to represent Nintendo back then, since his games had a basic style that majority of older games had, side-scroller. And Master Chief could easily represent the Xbox since the genre he was introduced in blew up for consoles with the release of the Xbox and Halo. I'm not sure what genre will represent the next generation, but whatever it is, Sony needs to be ready for it. They will need a good game with an interesting character, and this character would have to either represent the majority of PS3 gamers today, or a character that can bring in the next gen audience to PS3. They may be kids, but we were kids once too. And once you get kids started on gaming, as we all know, there is no going back. There's nothing wrong with a mascot representing a console. Some of you may think Mario is a milked franchise, but that so-called milked franchise has been selling Nintendo consoles for damn near 30 years. Milked or not, it works. This isn't the past generation. Sony has some heavy competition in the Wii, 360, and PC for that matter. If Sony is getting beaten by a product that, as we all know, can break down on you, and another product that has weak hardware compared to it, then there's something wrong with the way Sony is presenting that product to the world. Unlike Microsoft and Nintendo's tactics, and I'm sorry, but the word fan just isn't enough to make up for this. Sony needs their own gimmick, something that says, this is us and only us. And I think a mascot will help Sony. Sony doesn't seem to be advertising their product with a good enough mascot. Kevin Butler may be funny, but he's not a system seller. People need a bigger reason to buy a Sony console other than Kevin Butler told a joke. And I believe a game that represents either the majority of Sony fans or the next gen gamers will do wonders for them. What type of game do you think Sony could make to represent the PlayStation? As for me, I'm not sure. But I do have one question. Whatever happened to Crash Bandicoot?